issuing a subpoena regarding security clearances, which passed by voice vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Cummings?
Yes.
Mr. Cummings votes yes. Ms. Maloney?
Yes.
Ms. Maloney votes yes. Ms. Norton?
No. Yes.
Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Clay? Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes yes. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes yes. Mr. Connolly? Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Yes.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes yes. Mr. Raskin?
Yes.
Member mic check.
Mr. Raskin
Way up on
votes
the
yes. Mr. Ruda?
From the mic.
Mr. Ruda votes yes.
1, 2, 3.
Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill votes yes. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes yes. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes
Member
yes.
mic check. Right up on the
Ms.
mic.
Spear?
Little back from the mic. Little back.
Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes yes.
5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Mr. Desaulniers?
1, 2,
Mr. Desaulniers votes yes. Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Lawrence votes yes. Ms. Plaskett? Mr. Khanna? Mr. Khanna votes yes. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes yes. Ms. Acacia-Cortez? Ms. Acacia-Cortez votes yes. Ms. Presley? Ms. Presley votes yes. Ms. Tlaib? Ms. Tlaib votes yes. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes no. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar votes no. Ms. Fox? Mr. Massey? Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes no.
Is Mr. Sarbanes recorded?
Mr. Sarbanes is not recorded. Mr. Sarbanes votes yes.
Is Mr. Connolly?
Mr. Connolly is not recorded.
Mr. Connolly votes aye.
Mr. Connolly votes yes.
And Mr. Clay?
Mr. Clay is not recorded. Mr. Clay votes yes. On this vote, we have 22 ayes and 15 noes.
On this vote, there were how many?
22 yes, 15 no.
The resolution is agreed to. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The question now occurs on the resolution relating to issuing subpoenas relating to the 2020 census, which passed by voice vote. The clerk will call the roll.